Today we're going to talk about unbelief. Kind of an odd subject if you're coming to church, I suppose, but this is a different kind of unbelief that I wanted to share with you, and I appreciated Steve's comments. You know, Steve is steeped in the Bible and is extraordinarily gifted and talented and can quote scriptures far better than I can. And he paid me a compliment by saying I had put a spin on this that he hadn't really thought about. So I'm thinking, wow, you know, it must be a pretty good lesson, I guess. But I hope that you find some benefit to it. I've taken as the text Luke chapter 6, verse 38, which says nothing about unbelief, but I think if you'll follow me along today, you'll see how we kind of circle back to this verse. The Gospel of Luke chapter 6, verse 38. Give, and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together, so as to make room for even more, running over, and then poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. I'm sure everybody's had some similar experiences, like you sitting in the emergency room waiting. You're surrounded by perhaps anxious family members. I mean, you rushed to the ER the moment that you got the text or the Facebook post or the Instagram or the phone call. The teenage son of a really good neighbor of yours was involved in a car wreck, and he's in surgery. And your neighbors, your friends are in shock, and you, as a good neighbor that you are, would do anything for them. But in those circumstances, what can you do? Or another example, you try as best you can to conceal your shock at the news that you receive. Maybe your friend's teenage daughter is pregnant, she's confused, and is considering maybe an abortion. And your really good friend just blames herself, muttering what we've heard time and again, if only. What can you do during times like those? Or maybe even a more global picture today. You might sigh at the images you see on television. You know, there's another tornado that struck another city, another hurricane that struck an entire country. Schools are demolished, homes are destroyed, lives are lost. And you just see this utter devastation on the television. What can you do? What can you do about circumstances like that? What can you do when the challenge is greater than who you are? What can you do when the hurt is palpable, but it's not necessarily your own? When you feel helpless and impotent, what can you do? Where can you turn? Well, my suggestion for you this morning is you can turn to one of Jesus's, I think, most intriguing teachings about prayer. And it's taken from Luke chapter 11, verses 5 through 10. Here's what Jesus said. Suppose you went to a friend's house at midnight, wanting to borrow 3 loaves of bread. You say to him, a friend of mine has arrived for a visit, and I have nothing for him to eat. And suppose he calls out from his bedroom, don't bother me. The door's locked for the night, and my family and I are all in bed. I can't help you. But I tell you, though he won't do it for friendship's sake, if you keep knocking long enough, he will get up and give you whatever you need because of your shameless persistence. And so I tell you, keep on asking, and you will receive what you ask for. Keep on seeking, and you will find. Keep on knocking, and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, everyone who seeks finds, and to everyone who knocks, the door will be opened. Okay, so let's put this parable, this story of Jesus, into practical terms. Okay, so next slide there, Ray. That's you ringing the doorbell. It's midnight. The neighborhood is quiet. The streets are still. The sky is dark, and so is your friend's two-story home. But still, you ring that doorbell. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. And now your friend's house is a big house, and this ding dong is a really, really big noise. And your friend's chihuahua now wakes up. He has that snappy, who do you think you are kind of bark. Me, 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 me. So the ding dong and the dog barking, and you envision now what's probably going on upstairs. Your friend's wife is probably kicking him underneath the covers and saying, Hank, get up. Someone's at the door. Poor guy, Hank. 1 minute, he's sound asleep. And the next, he's being kicked out of bed. Doorbell ringing, dog barking. Hank is not going to like this. And there you are. The porch light comes on, and the door opens. And boy, does Hank look like a mess. He's wearing boxer shorts. He's wearing a t-shirt. He's got bedhead. His face is lined with pillow creases. And he's all covered in whiskers. I mean, you've never seen Hank quite this way. And then Hank says, what in the world are you doing here? Especially now. Do you know what time it is? And so you say, you know what, Hank? A friend of mine has arrived from out of town, and I don't have a thing to give him for a meal. And Hank, the homeowner, is now grumbling and complaining. Right, Diddy? But you insist, come on, Hank, please. I got nothing for my friend to eat. So finally, Frank acquiesces, opens the door, invites you into the kitchen, shows you the pantry, hands you a paper bag, and says, all right, just help yourself. And so you fill a basket with food, and you take it home, and now your surprise guest doesn't have to go to bed hungry. All because you spoke up on someone else's behalf. You see, church, that's called intercessory prayer. And that is intercessory prayer at its purest. It's this confluence of paucity and audacity. I can't heal them, but God, you can. I can't forgive them, but God, you can. I can't help them, but God, you can. That kind of prayer, I think, gets God's attention. And notice, it's not lengthy. It's not on your knees. It's not hands in the air or face looking down to the ground. It's none of that. It's a quick, short request for God's help. And I think those kinds of prayers get God's attention. I mean, after all, if Hank, who's a cranky, disgruntled neighbor because you're waking him up at midnight to ask for food, then if he'll help you out, well, how much more will God help you? I mean, God doesn't sleep. He's not going to come to the door looking like Hank. Bedhead and face all lined with pillow creases. That's not God. He doesn't sleep. He's never irritated. And when you knock on the door, he responds quickly and fairly. Jesus, if you will read through the entirety of the New Testament, never refused and intercessory prayer. Never, ever, never. Here's an example. Peter brought his concerns for his sick mother-in-law. Do you remember that? The centurion brought a request for his sick servant. Remember that story? Jairus had a sick daughter. A woman from Canaan had a demon-possessed daughter. From sunrise to sunset, Jesus heard one appeal after another. My uncle can't walk, Lord. Can you heal him? My son can't see, Lord. Can you heal him? My wife is in pain, Lord. Can you help her? He heard so many requests that at times the disciples attempted to turn people away. Do you remember that? If you don't, it's in Matthew chapter 15, verses 22 and 23. The disciples, along with Jesus, thought they had business to do, and Jesus is being mobbed by hundreds, if not thousands of people wanting him to heal them. And Jesus stops and does that. And at some point in time, the disciples say, come on, we got other things to do here, Lord. Let's keep moving on. And Jesus said no. Jesus wouldn't let the disciples turn him away from the healing ministry upon which he had embarked. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 30, it said, great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. I don't see any impatience there with Jesus. I don't see any impatience in his response. I mean, he didn't grow impatient at all. Well, there is one exception. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. You see, there was an exception. And here's how the story begins. A father brings Jesus his demon-possessed son. But instead of bringing him to Jesus because Jesus was otherwise occupied, this father brings the boy to Jesus' disciples. And they attempted to help this boy. But unfortunately, their efforts failed. When Jesus learned of their failure in attempting to heal this boy, I want you to listen to what Jesus said. This is Matthew chapter 17, verse 17. Again, this is Jesus responding to his disciples who cannot heal this boy. O faithless and perverse generation, how long am I going to have to put up with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. And if you read it that way, it's like, wow. I mean, Jesus is so uber patient, right? In the entirety of Scripture, you get this idea that Jesus is just this really patient person. But I don't see any patience here. Do you? I mean, unless I should say, oh, faithless and perverse generation. I don't think that's how Jesus said it. Now, anytime we see Jesus being a little bit impatient, I think is a little disconcerting. Because that's not really the image we have of Jesus. So, what was the oversight of the disciples? I mean, why was Jesus kind of getting it off his chest at this event? Well, if you take a look at what happened, the answer is really simple. You see, the disciples never took the boy to Jesus. In fact, I don't know that they even prayed for the boy through Jesus. I mean, they apparently did not do it physically in terms of trying to get Jesus involved with this situation. They never took the boy to Jesus, not in person and apparently not even in prayer. They attempted to heal the boy without calling on Christ. And so what did Jesus have to do? He commanded them to bring the boy here. Jesus had a really strong word for that. And you know what that word is? It's called unbelief. And here's why I say that. Because if you read further in verses 19 and 20 of Matthew chapter 17, here's what Jesus said. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, "Why couldn't we cast that demon out?" So Jesus said to them, "Because of your unbelief." Unbelief. That's attempting to help others without calling on Jesus. Belief, on the other hand, is pounding on God's door at midnight, being persistent, doing whatever it takes to present people to Jesus. A bit like, let's say, Moses at Mount Sinai. You recall that event, don't you? When God saw the golden calf stunt that the people were pulling off, remember that? I mean, he was ready to wipe out the nation of Israel. The Reader's Digest version of the story is Moses goes up the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments, and he's not gone more than a month, and the people are making a golden image of a calf and worshiping that. And at that point in time, God was done. I've had it. I'm going to wipe out the nation. I mean, these people were eyewitnesses to the 10 plagues that had plagued Egypt as they're exiting. They had seen the Red Sea parted in half. Their bellies were full of God-given manna and heaven-sent quail, but did they even bother to remember their deliverer? No. They danced the night away in front of a homemade statue. And God was not happy. Here's what it says in Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 7 through 10. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down from this mountain, because your people, the people you brought out of the land of Egypt, have ruined themselves. They have quickly turned away from the things I commanded them to do. I have seen these people, and I know that they are very stubborn. So now do not stop me. I am so angry with them, I am going to destroy them. Then I will make you and your descendants a great nation." Church, dry grass on Mount Vesuvius had a better chance than these children of God. Their only hope was that their octogenarian leader, Moses, who'd actually met God, could possibly on this same mountain some years earlier do what only Moses could do. If Moses had any clout at all, this was the time to use it. And thankfully he did. Let me read to you verses 11 and 12 of Exodus chapter 32. And I also want you to listen to the emphasis on whose people we're talking about. Remember, God said, your people, the people you took out of Egypt. Here's what Moses said. Moses begged the Lord his God and said, "Lord, don't let your anger destroy your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with your great power and strength. Don't let the people of Egypt now say, the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt for an evil purpose. He planned to kill them on the mountains and destroy them from the earth. So stop being angry and don't destroy your people." That's Moses talking to God. And look at his passion. I mean, he's on his face one minute, and he's in God's face the next. He's on his knees, and then he's pointing his finger, he's lifting his hands, he's shedding tears, he's ripping his cloak, he's wrestling like Jacob for the lives of his people. And how does God react to that? Exodus chapter 32, verse 14. So the Lord changed his mind and did not destroy the people as he said he might. Church, that is the promise of prayer, that you and I can change God's mind. Oh, really? Change God's mind? Well, listen to me. God's ultimate will is inflexible, but the implementation of his will is not. He doesn't change in his character. God doesn't change in his purpose, but God does alter his strategy because of the appeals of his kids. We do not change God's intention. I'm not even remotely suggesting to you that we do that. But we can influence his actions. After all, we are called the ambassadors of Christ, are we not? That's what it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20. Do you know what ambassadors do? They represent the government. They represent the king. They represent the monarch or the president. They represent the country. They speak with the authority of the throne. If an ambassador sends a request to the king, don't you think the king is going to listen? Well, I hope so. Otherwise, he's or she's not a very good ambassador, right? So if you, as God's ambassador in this world, come to your king with a request, don't you think he's going to listen? Absolutely. He does. And you actually have a seat with Christ in the heavens. That's what Paul was telling the church in Ephesus, Ephesians chapter 2, verse 6. Now, I don't know any of you have a seat on the Supreme Court. In fact, if you do, you need to leave because you're starting work tomorrow. And I don't know any of you that sit on the House of Representatives or in Congress. Nobody I know of here has that responsibility. But you do have one that is actually far more strategic than any of those. You have a seat in the government of God. And like a congressman, you represent a district. You speak on behalf of your family, perhaps, or your neighborhood, or your softball team, or your bowling team. Your sphere of influence is this region that you are representing. And as you grow in faith, guess what? Your district begins to expand. God burdens you now with concerns for, let's say, orphans, or people in a distant land, or needy people. And you respond to these promptings by praying. I mean, think of it as like you being Moses in your cul-de-sac, okay? Or you being Moses at your workplace, or you being Moses in the classroom. You plead with God on other people's behalf. Intercessory prayer, church, it acknowledges our inability and God's ability. We come with very empty hands, but really super high hopes. Why? Because in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 20, Paul writes, because God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. He will supply all of our needs according to his riches. That's what Paul told the church in Philippi, Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. And when God gives, he gives a gift that is, our text, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. That's your God. That's my God. That's what he does. The Apostle John wrote about prayer. Do you remember that? In the book of Revelation. And in his vision of heaven, John saw the prayers of the saints ascending like incense into the presence of God. Revelations chapter 8, if you have an interest. And here's what he wrote. Then an angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. That is the power of prayer. You ask God for help, and bam! Apparently, fire falls to the earth. You lift your concerns to heaven, and turbulence happens. So why not then knock at midnight on God's door? Stand up on behalf of those you love and you care about. Stand up on behalf of those that you don't. Matthew chapter 5, verse 44 says, pray for those who hurt you. Church, I will tell you, the quickest way to douse the fire of anger is with a big bucket of prayer. Rather than rant and rave and seek some sort of revenge, pray. Jesus did. Remember? While hanging on the cross, Jesus interceded for his enemies. Because Luke tells us in Luke chapter 23, verse 34, Jesus says the following from the cross, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. You see, church, Jesus, even Jesus, left his enemies in God's hands. And if Jesus does that, shouldn't we do the same? You are never more like Jesus than when you pray for others. Pray for those you love. Pray for those you don't. Pray for this hurting world. Present their case to the giver of bread and bring your grocery basket, because we know that you'll have plenty of blessings to take back to the object of your prayer. So that's a story about unbelief. It's not having no belief. It's just trying to act on your own behalf without getting God involved. But if, instead, you're concerned about a church or a family or a person or a friend or a coworker or a family member, lift them up to God in prayer. I mean, sure, you might be able to help them from a physical standpoint. You might be able to bring them groceries. But true belief is putting your request in the hands of the God who ultimately can provide the gift. And in that way, we are just simply the conduit of God's mercy and grace to those for whom we are praying. So this week, consider your life and your prayer life. Don't be like the disciples trying to heal a boy without getting Jesus involved. Instead, consider that their unbelief is what Jesus was trying to point out. The true belief is, get me involved and let me help. Because when you do, he will, and we have his promise. So we've picked out our last song. Ray, can you go to the next frame? I Need Thee Every Hour. As I told you earlier, every song we sang this morning was a prayer. And it's no different with this one. It's another prayer, acknowledging that we need God every hour. So we're going to stand and sing this song at the close. If you have any prayer requests, you can hand them up now, and then we'll talk about those prayer requests and be dismissed. Let's stand, please.